Welcome to Divcasts from the University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
All right, folks, I think we'll get started here. I'm Aaron Hollander, Associate Coordinator for Path Teaching, and along with Dean Mitchell and Brandon Klein, the Program Coordinator, I'm excited to welcome you to the Winter 2015 Dean Seminar on the Path of Teaching with our guest, Chancellor Rebecca Chopp. The Dean Seminar, as most of you know, is our flagship program for Path of Teaching, highlighting issues of course design and institutional context. Our distinguished alumni are ideators in the field and represent diverse approaches to both of these emphases, and so it's a major goal for Path of Teaching to bring them and their insights back to Swift Hall. Before I turn things over to Dean Mitchell to introduce our guests, just a couple of announcements. First, please do sign in if you haven't already. I think most of you have. That's our way to collect attendance and assign Path of Teaching credit, which is now taking place through our fancy new database. So it's all automated now. So please do sign in. Grab coffee and lunch if you haven't. 2 upcoming events to bring to your attention, along with the onslaught of emails that will surely follow. This Monday, we have our workshop on teaching the undergraduate research paper. And that will be with our bibliographer in religion and philosophy, Ann Knappel, and our Divinity School Library intern, David Frankel, and that's in Swift 201 at noon. And Friday, February 27th is the currently annual syllabus workshop with Professor Lucy Pick. It's a great opportunity to develop skills in syllabus design and workshop either ideas in progress or finished syllabi, things you've taught, things you'd like to teach. That does require advanced registration, so please do email Professor Pick ASAP, but no later than a week before, with a title of the course, a paragraph description, and maybe a list of readings or ideas that you'd like to include in that. All those details are on the website, but I want to bring it again to your attention. So with no further ado, I'll turn things over to Dean Mitchell to introduce our guest.
Thank you, Aaron. And I want to thank Aaron publicly for coming on board this year as the Associate Coordinator of the Path of Teaching program and just seamlessly moving into place and doing such a fantastic job. And also Brandon Klein, our coordinator for the program. It's really a pleasure and an honor to work with such skilled organizers and passionate voices for our Path of Teaching program. And I thank you for all that you put into this program. I think we all do around the table. I'm seeing nods, so turn your nod. So before I have the pleasure to introduce Chancellor Chopp, I'd like to ask us to go around the room, and I would like to ask you to introduce yourselves. You may say what you wish, but one prompt would be your degree program and maybe a little something about your interests, your intellectual interests. If you want to continue on your teaching, if you're currently teaching or thinking about teaching or other things, that's fine. So, Aaron.
Again, I'm Aaron Hollander. I'm a 5th-year PhD candidate in theology. Working on Greek Orthodox hagiographies and teaching currently in the humanities court as a writing intern in Greek thought literature. I'm also a Swarthmore College alum, a little before your tenure, but it's good to know you.
My name is Kelly Gardner. I'm a 4th-year PhD student in Hebrew Bible. And I'm focused on my exams right now, but I'm looking forward to doing more teaching in the coming year or two. And I work on women in Hebrew Bible in particular.
I'm Emily Cruz, a PhD student in History of Religions, and my work is on African religions in Africa and in the U.S.
I'm Tim Gutman. I'm a 4th-year candidate. My dissertation is on modernization and the discourses of tradition in Egypt and in China at the turn of the 20th century. I've taught Chinese history, and I've just applied to teach a number of introductions to Islam.
I'm Allison Gray. I'm a PhD candidate in New Testament and Early Christian Literature, and my dissertation is about Gregory of Nyssa's biographical works.
I'm Sonia Kim, PhD candidate in Technical Politics and Literature, writing dissertation on religion.
I'm Richard Zaleski. I'm a third-year PhD student in New Testament early Christian literature. I'm interested in interpretational, especially allegorical methods in the early church, by thinkers such as Gregory of Nyssa.
I'm Caroline England. I'm a master's student interested in religious ethics and research ethics, as well as
My name is Ernest Brooks. I'm a first-year MA student here at the Divinity School, and I'm also interested in ethics, particularly in how ethics is translated in institutional context and in social systems.
I'm Evan Keene. I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate in theology. I'm TAing in the humanities core and writing a dissertation on Ernest Charles.
I'm Elizabeth Sartella. I'm a PhD student in Islamic Studies. I look at medieval mysticism and history of science, and that's what I write about.
Hi, my name is Mary Sababi. I am a second-year PhD student in Islamic Studies. I focus on early modern Persian literature and poetry. I'm also teaching this year in Persian, so.
My name is Yoni Shamash. I'm a PhD student in history of Judaism, studying medieval Jewish and Islamic philosophy and theology. TAing this quarter as well.
My name is Gabrielle. I'm Paris. I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate in theology, and my work is on religion and medicine, specifically on the theology of medicine, healing, physical doctrine, and early modern theater. And I'm currently TAing, but I came to grad school after a few years of teaching.
My name is Ryan Bingham. I'm a first-year MA student, and my central interests are in early 19th century American literature.
I'm Matt Peterson. I'm also a first-year master's student, and I'm interested in philosophy of religion.
Ezra Blasting, third-year PhD student in history of Judaism, focused on medieval Judeo-Arabic texts, at least at the moment, particularly the nexus of medieval Jewish and Islamic law.
I'm Chaz Preston. I've been here so long I don't remember what you I'm working on 20th century Sanskrit literature, and I've done some work teaching the writing program, teaching my own course next quarter in the Divinity School on Indian secular.
I'm Christine Trotter. I'm a third-year PhD student in New Testament and early Christian lit, and I'm interested in eschatology in the early church.
I'm Jordan. I'm a fifth year. I'll be writing on biblical prophecy, Hebrew Bible, and I'm a lecturer in biblical Hebrew.
Michael Lishmoli, a PhD student in religious ethics, fourth year, planning a dissertation on individual member responsibility for institutions and organizations using all recurring Catholic Church.
Eric Treff, sixth year PhD student in history of Judaism, focusing on Spinoza and the intellectual love of God. TAing for Professor Wendy's floor, and I applied to teach various versions of the Leo Strauss course.
I'm Elsa Marty, second-year PhD student in theology, and my work focuses on contemporary Christian theology in India.
Brandon Klein, coordinator of the Catholic teaching and PhD candidate in New Testament for the Christian literature, writing on Justin Martyr's and Hopkins.
And I'm Margie Mitchell, and I'm student and I teach New Testament early Christian literature. And I'm not teaching this quarter, but I will be teaching the introduction to New Testament next quarter, having had a 3-year hiatus after teaching it for 11 years in a row. So it's like getting back on the horse. So I've really been looking forward to this day for some time, trying to get on the calendar of Rebecca Chopp for a few years. But it's really both a personal and a professional pleasure to welcome you back to Swiss Hall. Rebecca Chopp is the Chancellor of the University of Denver, the 18th Chancellor in the school's history. A distinguished and passionate leader in higher education. She is also previous president of Swarthmore College, as has been mentioned by a loyal alum, where she served as president since 2009, and previously was president of Colgate University, and prior to that served as provost and executive vice president for academic affairs at Emory University and dean of Yale Divinity School. Chancellor Chopp holds the BA degree from Kansas Wesleyan University, a Master of Divinity from St. Paul School of Theology, and she received a PhD in theology from the Divinity School. She was honored as the Divinity School's Alumna of the Year in 1997. We also were just discussing that when I was a student here in the 80s, 83, 84, Professor Chopp was the director of the DMin program here in the Divinity School and was pivotally instrumental in transforming it into an MDiv program. And there are a couple of alums of the MDiv program over here, so you have a debt to pay. Chancellor Chopp is the author of some 6 books, both on the philosophy and practice of education and on constructive theology, including Remaking College, Innovation and the Liberal Arts, which she co-edited with Hartford College President Dan Weiss, a selection of which is in the advanced reading for today. And other notable publications include The Praxis of Suffering and Interpretation of Liberation and Political Theology, and The Power to Speak, Feminism, Language, and God. She's also published many articles and essays in both of those different areas. So please join me in welcoming Chancellor.
Thank you. Since I'm short, I'm going to stand up, please, for a brief presentation. It's great to be here. I bet each and every alum who comes back here to speak to you feels exactly like I do. I just want to be of help. The Divinity School was an incredibly transformative experience for me. I went to a school called Kansas Wesleyan. Don't know if you've ever heard of it. First generation college kid. I had no idea what I was getting into when I came to the Divinity School, and it was really my transformative educational experience. A tough transformation sometimes, but a transformation nonetheless. I'm very deeply indebted to the school. So I just came to see how I could be helpful. I was asked to talk a little bit about not my teaching side, though I taught full time for about 15 years and have taught off and on, like your dean does ever since. But to really talk about the administrative side. And for a while, I kind of drug my heels. It wasn't just that I was busy, because back in my day, any self-respecting Divinity School student would wonder why somebody had devolved. Why waste any good talent? If you could get into a school like this, why blow it? But maybe I can explain that, or at least give you an illustration, because I can assure you, nobody in my era thought we were going to be presidents or chancellors, and now 3 of the 40 or 50 who entered with me are presidents or chancellors, and others are deans. So yeah, so to grab hold of, if you've ever been asked to be on a committee or organize anything, be careful. But I also want to talk about higher education. Whether or not you ever become an administrator, you need to understand the institutionality, and I was glad to hear several of you were interested in institutionality and ethical issues. If you do nothing more than teach for the rest of your life, you will be part of an institution. There have been generations of faculty who haven't had to worry about it. Things just went smoothly forward. But now our institution, higher education, is under its most dramatic change since the 1860s in the country, if not the world, and so I want to talk about that. So let me first talk a bit just about, see if I can figure this out.
The wheel.
The wheel?
On the side.
This one? Ah, how about that? Well, I have a PhD in theology. Okay, we'll go back. Okay, why administration? So I thought I'd begin first by talking about why someone who was a very successful faculty person was a full professor by the time I was about 37 and got a university chair at Emory by the time I was 40. So that's good. So why would someone go into administration? And part of it was what was going on in my discipline in a place like Emory, in a place like the South at that time. But part of it was that I increasingly found myself thinking about the institutional context of which I was a part. And as I got asked to serve on committees and do things like be the director of women's studies at Emory for a while or chair a large teaching commission at Emory, I found myself more and more fascinated by it intellectually. Because institutions are so complex, and universities like Emory was amazing to watch how people lived and how faculty and students lived in the medical school, how they lived at the School of Theology, how they lived in the arts and sciences. And I began to be very, very interested in just the incredibly comprehensive nature of a university. So I became provost when I was 42. I was on the faculty at Candler School of Theology and the Graduate Division of Religion. I was one of the ones who benefited probably from affirmative action. There was a president at the time who decided he was going to have a woman or a person of color be the next provost at Emory, and I think I was probably the least I was probably liked by the most amount of people, which meant, because I was off in theology, no one knew me that much. So overnight, I became provost, and it was really fascinating because of the comprehensive engagement. It was interesting learning the world of healthcare, because healthcare was under phenomenal duress at the time. My second week as provost, I got a call in the middle of the night from the Executive Vice President of Health Affairs. It was 2 a.m. in the morning. He said, "I need you in your office now." I said, "What?" And he said, "Dr. So-and-so just took out naming one of the wealthiest donors to Emory's wrong eye." Not ethical, legal issues. He said, "This is the life of a provost." So that's a job. Trying to solve so there were all the just kind of interesting moral, ethical issues of engagement. I also found it a great way to be truly creative. I realized early on, some people are wired to like creativity more than others. When I went to Emory, I was next door. Constructive theologian, I was next. So my office was next door to a guy named Walt Lowe. They were the recurring scholars, somebody who's working on recur. Walt Lowe worked on Bart from the day he was a PhD student at Yale until the day he retired, and probably still works on Bart. And I walked in and got to know Walt and said, I couldn't do it, right? We're all wired different ways. So administration really gave me a way to be incredibly creative. We think about it as committee after committee after committee and policy after policy after policy, and it is that. But there are also lots of times where the leadership part comes in, and the leadership is taking that creative ball and running down the court with it. And it's always about finding where the emergent is happening among the faculty and the students. Give a good example, it's the Swarthmore example. So when I went to Swarthmore, one of the wealthiest schools in the country, a school well known as the place to send people to PhD programs for Chicago. I think that's the perfect degree. Incredibly intellectual student body. There was a lot of energy around where the liberal arts was headed at Swarthmore, but there was no real coordination. There was also a deep longing for faculty, especially, to talk to one another across the disciplines, and yet the academy is very, very silent. So working with a group of faculty, we created an Institute for the Future of Liberal Arts, which was really a cross-disciplinary, almost graduate seminar ongoing that had different dimensions and different ramifications. And this institute got funding immediately, and within 2 years we got a $10 million gift for the institute so that Swarthmore could kind of regain its place as an innovator in liberal arts. And I could talk about more of this, but for me the creativity has been finding out where the intellectual life needs, where the kind of emergent possibilities are, where the passions are, and building structures and resources that will work around that. I've also enjoyed culture flexing. So those of you who studied anthropology know exactly what I mean by that. It's the ability to learn and adapt and interact in other cultures. Some administrators stay forever. The provost I now have the pleasure of working with at DU has been at DU for 31 years. My journey has been to change organizations and institutions, and I have found it fascinating. I think it's the hermeneutical side of me. I've studied with people like Ricker and Tracy. So for me, understanding the essence of what it is in an organization that one can join, that brings out in your own personality, that challenges you intellectually to adapt, is just fascinating. And I'll give the example of going from Colgate to Swarthmore, two very fine liberal arts colleges, both in the top 20. Colgate, I don't know if any of you know it, but it is about athletics and it is about Greek life, two things I knew nothing about. As a university student, I mean nothing about it. So I went to Colgate and found it fascinating. It was a very, very aggressive culture. Ended up sending a lot of people to Wall Street. Culture of great energy, kind of under-resourced. So its myth about itself was the little engine that could, if you ever read that child's book, really underfunded, underdeveloped in some ways, sitting out in Hamilton, New York. And yet in the top 20 and really among the small liberal arts colleges in America producing more Wall Street people than any. And then I went to Swarthmore, which is like the complete opposite. Wall Street is a very dirty word. Yeah, we would not know if ever say anything about Wall Street. Highly intellectual. The alums, incredibly intellectual. One of the nicest things about being at Swarthmore was traveling with the alums, because I literally felt like it was always a grad school seminar. They were so smart and they always wanted to debate and talk. So going in between those two cultures and studying them, learning them, but also joining them brings out different sides. It's a kind of ongoing research and intervention. And then the fourth reason why, for me, administration has been a great choice is because I think you really do impact the future. I think Whitehead was right, that education is about building the future, and I think administrators are about fundamentally stewarding those institutions into the future. And especially in a time when we do face phenomenal changes, I think being an administrator is about literally trying to recreate these institutions. So what does a chancellor do? A chancellor is just another name for president. I don't know why some use the French term and some use the British term, but that's what occurs in America. Here's how I think about my job. This is my third job where I've been a president or a chancellor. I have to oversee everything, but what I concentrate on is evaluating, selecting, supporting talent. That's deans, that's the head of the library, that's the head of IT. That's all those people who build the systems and the support structures for the faculty and the student. And we were talking, Nadine and I were talking about metrics and measurements and all of those things and how they dominate higher ed. In hiring people, I pay very little attention to that. Because in higher education, you have to hire people who can develop relationships. So the head of an IT department has to be able to work in the Divinity school and in the medical school. And that's a special kind of person. Build and support community. I still believe that education at its heart is about a community of scholars, and that there are ways to tend and nurture community. And maybe I learned that at the Div School about Wednesday lunches. Maybe I learned it in the MDiv programs about studying religious organizations. But I think a lot of administrators don't pay enough attention to what it is just to cultivate the community so that people flourish. Vision and strategy is extremely important. Where a school is headed is always a question, but in this time a phenomenal change, and I'll talk about all the changes I see happening in a moment. I spend a lot of time trying to avoid committee work and trying to make my provost do it so that I can be thinking with people about where are we going with DU. And let me just say a word about going to DU, which has been an interesting step in my journey. So coming from Kansas Wesleyan to Chicago, I assumed that my career would be to go back, if I was lucky, and teach at a place like Kansas Wesleyan, which is a great school in the middle of Kansas. And life turned out a little bit differently for me, and I had the privilege of serving in some really selective places, some really wonderful, highly selective institutions, Emory, Yale, Colgate, and Swarthmore. And my husband and I were beginning to think about retirement. I was going to re-up at Swarthmore for a couple more years, and the University of Denver came calling. It was a place we knew we were going to retire to because my family has moved from Kansas to Denver. That's what you do when you grow up in Kansas. You try to get to Denver. And also I was really fascinated because DU's own particular trajectory as a university has been a kind of near-death experience in the early 80s, and now it's growing and expanding, and it's a very hot school in terms of undergraduate admissions. It's also not particularly elite. It's ranked 88th in the U.S. News ranking. It's got a very tiny endowment. It's totally tuition dependent. And so I thought, wow, that's really interesting. It's been my last job in a place that's really different in terms of how the finances work and how the faculty have their jobs and who the students are. So I now spend a lot of time trying to develop a vision, not assuming that I have the largest endowment per student in the country like I did at Swarthmore, but about the cheapest endowment in the country. So resources make a difference. Represent the institution. If you'll allow me to use a Christian analogy, there is a way in which I think the president or chancellor is the priest. That you preside, you represent, you invoke the institution. People need to be able to see the institution in you, and your tone and mood really do set the tone many times for the institution. It may set the tone for resistance to the centrality, but it sets the tone. That sounds like something right out of an MBA manual, and I resisted that notion for years and years and years. But now I've come to realize that people really do need to have some kind of figure, symbolic presence that represents the institution to them. They need that internally and they need that externally. Again, at a place like Swarthmore, that was so that the students could storm the president's office. It's a little bit different at DU, but it's still important. And then finally, I spend an awful lot of time raising money. I don't think about it like that necessarily. I think the greatest opportunity is to allow somebody to invest in the future. Again, because that's what I think education is about. I think it's about the future of humanity, the future of the country, the future of various groups and peoples. For me, raising money is about allowing people the privilege to invest in that future. So just a quick, I always have people say, so what does it take to be a president or chancellor? Stamina. I don't know that I work any longer hours than I did as a faculty member or as an intellectual. I can remember my hours at Chicago when I was teaching and running the D-Man programs pretty much from 5 or 6 in the morning till 10 or 11 at night. So I don't think it's any longer hours. I think it's a different kind of work in which you're always on and you're not having that nice, meaningful, enriching activity study, but instead you're running sometimes like a dentist or a doctor from appointment to appointment every 20 minutes. So it takes a lot of physical stamina. I still believe it takes moral integrity. The issues are big and they're huge. And one has to approach them with, I think, a degree of wisdom. So easy to understand ethics. I studied a lot of ethics here. If one does not put it in the context of moral ambiguity, But once you're in institutions, it's always morally ambiguous. So I'll tell you the toughest thing I think I ever faced. Well, I've had several, but one was when I went to Colgate. They had a very large Greek system. About 70% of the students are involved in the Greek system. And at Colgate, it was, when I got there, pretty much out of control. The fraternities were not owned by the university. They were owned by the alumni, and the alumni were all busy working on Wall Street 4.5 hours away. So put 80 young men in a rural context with unlimited alcohol in a house, and what happens? Disaster, by and large. Alums wouldn't allow us to close the system down like Williams and other schools had done. It was just too much a part of their DNA. Faculty and the president myself wouldn't allow it to continue the way it was. So I had to figure out a solution that would be, that the board would accept, that would improve it, and that I knew would not fix it, but would at least improve the system. So in the end, I got the board convinced to buy the houses and to own them, so we could own the facilities, so we could put our staff in there, so we could have early warning systems, so that we could go in and intervene when things were getting out of control, because we were not even allowed to step foot in the houses. So it helped. It was a good decision. It didn't fix things, but I could not cave to the immense pressures by the alumni. And there were pressures. They had a website against me. There was a long discussion about could I be compared to, was I more like Hitler or Mussolini? Seriously, as you drove out of town, there were big billboards denouncing me. There were two ways into the town, and there were big billboards. We got calls in the middle of the night. My high school teachers were getting nasty letters. I mean, it was all bizarre. And the pressure is really intense. The board wanted to cave, and yet, you know, you have to stand fast. That was probably the toughest one. I remember seeing the whole and imagining the future again. So I look around the country and I see presidents come and go, and I think, who are the ones who make it? Who are the ones who stay? Presidents, deans, and I would say these last two are the two most important. So many times somebody gets into an administrative role and they only like the budget, or they only want to take care of the faculty, or they just want to fix the curriculum, and you really can't do that to be successful. You just have to be willing to not major simply in theology, but in Bible, history, sociology. You've got to be able to do it all at once. You're never going to do it completely successfully, so you get the right people around you. That you have to be able to see the whole and take your bets and predict where the future is. And emotional intelligence and interpersonal skills. Again, seeing the presidents come and go around the country, seeing deans come and go around the country. I think the survival is also deeply related to one's ability to work with people, to be listening, to be able to challenge. This is a people person's job. When I was at the Greek school, I think had someone given me a Myers-Briggs, I wouldn't have ever taken it, but has invented by two Swarthmore grads. I'm so glad you're here. But if one had given me one, I'm pretty sure I would have been right in the middle between introversion and extroversion. There was nothing I loved more than going to Regenstein. Nothing I loved more than studying for my qualifying exams. Happiest moment of my life. That is the truth. I think now when I take the Myers-Briggs, and I occasionally do as a team building experience, I'm like in the 90% extroversion. So it calls it out. Your personality changes. Okay, so that's enough about administration. Let me talk quickly about some of the changes going on in higher ed. So when you study higher ed in this country, you read a lot about times of significant change. And of course, one such time was in the early part of the 20th century with people like Hopkins and Dewey and the progressive education movement. And And that had in part to do with trying to really bring science in fully to the culture of the academy, and also it had to do with immigration patterns, especially what was happening in places like Chicago and New York City. Another second great change you read about is World War II with the GI Bill, and that was a tremendous transformation. Many of the schools you will go teach in will tell the stories about Quonset huts being built so the GIs could come back. But that was really an expansion. Another one was the 60s. Two things went on in the 60s, actually. One was the explosion of research funding from the U.S. government. Started in the 50s for the sciences, exploded in the 60s for all of the disciplines, and a research model by the faculty and the vision of what it was to be a researcher really came to play a significant role in higher ed. Until then, it was really for a very select few faculty. And the second thing, of course, was the civil rights movement and the entrance of large numbers of women and persons of color into higher education, and also a cultural shift to understand students as adults, which we didn't really have even at a graduate level until then. All those changes aside, I will maintain that nothing in any of those changes is as great as what's happening now, and that the real historical period to compare it to is the 1860s, when we had multiple changes going on. So if you look back at your 1860s, you'll see that there were huge financial changes and financial pressures on higher education. There was a changing urban culture. Youth were doing something very different, and they were thinking about something very different. There was a huge public debate about what education was about. There were technological changes called industrialization, and the purpose of education more and more got focused on preparing people for industrialization. If you haven't read Kathy Davidson's Now You See It, I would encourage you to. It's a fun, quick read some evening, if you have an evening free to watch TV. But what Davidson does is brilliantly sketch out the 1860s and the shift to industrialization. That's when we began to adopt, when public education was really born, and we began to adopt that, 9 o'clock you learn math, 10 o'clock you learn English, et cetera, and you got grades, and the grades, the whole notion of grading was borrowed from the meat industry, grading of beef. Until then, there were no grades. It's a little fascinating historical story. But just to say, I think we're facing the same kind of tremendous changes. John Chapman, the head of Colgate at Kappa, says every single sector in higher education is under challenge and change. And I think that's true. I can't think of any sector where people are not fundamentally questioning the paradigm, be it in the nature of knowledge, the nature of education, or just the institutional structures. Let me talk about a few of them. Financial facts and pressures. We all know this. Adina and I were talking about it. Everybody's screaming about the cost of higher education. Inflated adjusted income in higher ed, that is largely tuition and endowment, has increased by 281% in the, I'm sorry, this is really just tuition. So this has increased 281% by the privates and 368% by the publics. As you probably all know, the public institutions are devastated. I would not be the president of a public or anything in the world. University of Colorado, very, very good public. 20 years ago, about 60% of its budget was paid for by the state. Today, 4% is. And the state still has complete control over the policies, the practices, sometimes even getting rid of tenured faculty. So what is going on in the state, across the United States, is really devastating. And if you have friends who teach in publics, you can hear their stories. No raises for 6 years, bigger and bigger teaching loads, more and more ideological control. Now, in private education, the cost driver has been really three things, I guess. One has been financial aid, So almost all of us have increased our financial aid dramatically. Swarthmore's just since 2002 has increased by 275%. 83% of our students get some kind of financial aid. There are a few schools, Swarthmore is one of them, and rightly and goodly so, that don't have any students paying tuition. Well, let me say it differently. They're need-blind admissions, so any student can get whatever aid they really need. I just heard about the aid the PhD students get here. We didn't have that back in my day. So it's been good. We have all raised aid, but where do you get that aid from? In part, you get it by increasing your tuition. It's kind of Robin Hood system where the wealthy pay for the less wealthy. I think it's a great democratic system myself, but donors and alumni often question the fundamental redistribution of wealth that goes on in the financial aid discount rate. The second area is the services we now provide. Counseling centers, fitness centers, community engagement programs. Until really the 90s, education was very narrow. It was about you and the faculty member with a very few services. Now we understand education much more holistically. Part of that, commodification of consumerism. Part of it, parents and grad students saying, you know, they're going to go to the nicest place or to the best place, etc. On the undergraduate programs, it's often parents who want the nice dorms, who want the fitness center, who wants to make sure there's an incredible counseling center. And the third driver is regulation. And we are an incredibly regulated industry, much more so than we were in the 80s and 90s. So private institution still, in my judgment, provides a phenomenal education. Not everyone can go, very few can go, but it's a great luxury because of the low student-faculty ratio, the attention to how it is students learn the deep belonging to an institution. The value proposition is incredibly important. I won't go through this because you're all graduates of undergrad programs, so you know that just on a financial factor, let alone a transformative or life satisfaction factor, you make more money once you get BA. I read that yesterday that they just announced that the unemployment rate for undergrads in this country is now 2.9%. That's essentially full employment for those with undergraduates. So you will read in the paper and you will have board members and alumni say, should anyone even bother going to college? I mean, there's Steve Jobs, right? Just go off and invent Apple or something. But for most of us, this is the best bet. Technology is a phenomenal change agent in higher education. Some of you may have read Randy Bass's article. Randy's at Georgetown, very savvy with technology and one of the great prophets of how technology will change higher ed. I think that most of us right now in higher ed, at least in the privates, are not thinking that our jobs will be replaced. We're not thinking that the average 18 to 21-year-old can actually go to school online. And we're not thinking that persons like yourself would substitute this kind of education for an online education. Rather, those online programs, and we're seeing it this way already, simply are providing more access. They're expanding the democratization, which is a great thing. The real impact is how they're changing learning and how they're changing how we teach. And I'm sure you've seen this already in your teaching. The whole notion of flipped classrooms, very few great lecturers. Now people want, students and faculty want those lectures videotaped. They want to watch them, and the kids want to watch them in their pajamas or late at night, and then they can come in and have a seminar. I think it's a great thing. I think it's kind of USC model, not too many lectures, just get together and have a great seminar. There are profound changes due to technology and the expectations of undergrads, and some of you, we can talk about this because some of you probably see it. Undergrads used to have to come into the office and talk to a faculty member. Now the expectation in many places is just simply email or texting. And faculty are expected to be available 18 hours a day in many schools, and it really changes the faculty-student relationship. And we can talk about that, if that's good or not, but it's certainly changing it. The millennials, lots of significant research here. Most of you are millennials, it looks like. But college students today are a very different breed than we have seen in the past. How they learn, how they interact, whether we like it or not. About 90% of this generation go to college to get a better paying job than their parents. In 1986 and before, the number one reason to go to college in this country was personal meaning and satisfaction. Be prepared to enter a profession. It was much more a humanistic model about becoming a complete person. College was also much more narrowly defined for the privileged elite in this country. As we democratized, had more first generation students, more working class students, we've seen the shift, especially in the context of a consumer-based culture, that college is really about workforce readiness. It's about giving the tools. If you read the Layman article, we've all become land-grant universities. We're just supposed to train people. It's not that deep, reflective, transform, form the character, cultivate the Aristotelian understanding of education. I won't talk too much about the 21st century students. You see them more than I do. They are very structured. They are less resilient. They want to know the answers before they even know the questions. Several weeks ago, I was talking to 3 colonels who are at DU studying. We have a very famous international school, the Cornell School, and they're there for a year. And so I asked them what it was like for a volunteer army and the millennials. I mean, I was thinking, I bet there's not these problems. And the colonels told me for the next hour about moms calling. Enough said. Different generation. But I will say, research and my own experience says also that these kids, it's a really neat generation too. They are very innovative. So it's interesting. They don't want to take risks. But 70% of the DU undergrads come in saying they want to be entrepreneurs. Why? Because they're creative. They don't want to go to an office. They don't want to work their way up. They're innovative. They're creative. They are very civically engaged. All the research shows that. The hottest thing in college now is community engagement. These students like to learn by doing. So put them in a project out in the field, out in the city, take them on study abroad, even intensive research in the humanities, and then teach them the seminar. That's how they learn. They want to make a difference. They hate institutions. They don't trust government. I worry about where any politicians or civil servants will come from the millennials, because they're not into DC at all. But they want to have hands-on impact in building communities. They are also, all the research shows, more spiritual, not religious. Some of them are, but what I think that spirituality is about, and I did a project with some scholars from UCLA some years ago. So from a human side, what I think it is about is this generation is wary, simply living their life around money, even though they want to go to college to get a job. They're post-recession children. They are aware that the world can financially collapse. And so they're looking for some kind of meaning and meaningfulness in college. And at least not since I started teaching undergrads. I've seen this so strong in the undergrads. Demographics, you'll probably know these demographics. We are becoming a more diverse country. More women than men are going to college. That would be interesting for employment in the future. And the final one, next to the last one, I just wanted to mention, because it really is a source of some fascination and a great deal of concern to me, is that we are becoming an enormously regulated industry. The latest public expression under regulation has been around Title IX. And as a feminist scholar, I've worked a lot on rape. This is a good news that we are finally stepping up to the issue of sexual assault on our campuses, for sexual assault for women and for men, of course. But the way it's being done can be very, very troubling, because again, we've got policies and procedures instead of education and relationships. So maybe we'll catch up over time. But it's one expression of just the amount of regulation. So at Swarthmore, we did a presentation for the board of the regulations since 1991 that affected Swarthmore, and we ended up with 16 single-spaced pages of state or federal regulations. So if you're an administrator, you all of a sudden have to become a policy wonk and make sure that these regulations are followed. But, you know, regulations to me have to be understood as what's going on here, what's the deeper expression, what's really going on in this country. And this is my best guess, and I've only found one book I can cite. It's a book by Peter Lake, who studies higher education. Until the 1960s, we were basically in this country followed a policy of in love with prejudice. So I'm going to talk more about undergrad. But there were some interesting adaptations for grads as well. So student comes to a college, basically the faculty and the administration were the parents. And whatever they said went. And the student had no rights, and there were very strict regulations. The second era was called the bystander era. The 70s and 80s arose out of the 60s, and the bystander meant just stand by and do nothing, literally, if you're the government or the courts. So if you were a student that experienced rape or violence or some gross mistreatment in the 70s and the 80s, the courts basically wouldn't support you against the university. And if you had sexual assault or alcohol incidents, the courts basically said you're an adult. So you can take it through the courts, but there was no sense that the university had the obligation to keep a safe environment until very recently. And starting in the 90s, the courts have taken on what's more called a duty stand. So I see this as the culture saying 18 to 21-year-olds aren't really adults. And I think that's probably a good thing. And if they're not really adults, and you bring them to campus, and their parents pay significant money for the undergraduate tuition room and board, then the community has a responsibility to protect them. The evolution we're seeing from just protection is now one I rather like, and it is about cultivating them, moral development, character development, all those things that nobody could talk about since the 50s or 60s are all of a sudden now back, and we're seeing them referenced in court cases, and we're seeing more and more work on them. All right, I've gone on too long, so I'm just going to finish quickly by saying my last 3 points. Another place that higher ed is under phenomenal critique is public criticism. Any bookstore you go into, there will be many, many books questioning the value of higher ed, questioning the quality. If you've not read Academically Adrift or heard about it, it is a book that basically maintains, with citing some research, that many students are weaker intellectually after college than they are before. So there's a huge public outcry against higher education. Now, the public is criticizing almost every major institution. In the 21st century, we're at the end of an institutional era, perhaps, or at least we're demanding lots of transformation. But there is serious public criticism of higher education. We feel these pressures in working with boards, working with donors, with alumni, and that does make a difference for you because there's more ideological pressure on who's being hired in these institutions and what they're teaching. And again, if you want to cultivate Johnny or Mary, how will they cultivate them? So there's a big critique about the liberalization of faculty in America. That's kind of how I feel some days. On the iceberg that's melting. So at the same time, I think there are two other things I'll just put briefly on the table, and I find them really fascinating. So we have all these changes in institutionality and how culture sees higher ed and how we're going to be financed and who the students are and now who the faculty are. 54% of the DU faculty are now Generation X or Y, right? So they're millennials. They're not boomers. The boomers are all retired. So that's all really fascinating. But the two other great things that I think are going on, if you want to be an administrator, is thinking about where knowledge is. So knowledge has its own history. Every good U of C student knows that. It's not an essential structure. The 20th century, as Max Weber predicted in his Taylor lectures, was all about bureaucratization. It was about silos. It was about special language games. I think about the metaphors used when I was in graduate school. Master a discipline. Go deep. Spend your life on a footnote of art. That would be good. That was the 20th century model. The 21st century model is much more problem-based, much more interdisciplinary. Even within the disciplines, it's much more about networking. Learners are social. No one tries to master information. It's now how you create or design knowledge. Much more about collaboration. Employers, for instance, tell us now that they want the classical liberal arts skills, critical thinking, communication skills, but now they want 21st century skills, collaboration and problem solving in diverse teams. And this is very interesting because one of my passions has been diversity and inclusivity in higher ed. And of course, for years we argued the moral rightness. For years we said, bring different people to the table. You'll have different sets of resources. And we were arguing against our boards, arguing against our alumni, arguing against employers, and now the employers have so outpaced us because it is good for business. So it's a really interesting argument. Now we're trying to get higher ed to catch up. So what knowledge is a real challenge. And internally, I see it all the time at DU, I saw it at Swarthmore and Colgate, we are so structured in these silos. In what we are majoring in, that the disciplines are, that's how we hire, that's how we tenure, that's how we promote. But the passions intellectually aren't necessarily comfortable within those walls. So how to think about that going forward will be a major challenge. And then the other one is the one I've already mentioned. I'll just kind of show how that. It is a sense that, especially on the undergraduate level, but I think it seeps into the graduate level, that we have to do more than just provide information or just train the mind. That education is also about the cultivation of an individual in the context of a community. And that language has been so forgotten in much of American higher education. And now we're seeing it introduced in a real kind of focus on what's called intentional community and a real willingness to say we have every right when an undergrad is in a dorm to require conflict resolution classes, to require diversity classes, to require ethics programs. So that's another really interesting change. And again, happening more on the undergraduate than the graduate level, but many of you will teach on the undergraduate level. So let me sit down. Happy to chat about anything. Happy to see if any of this resonates with what you're seeing in your classes.
Someone turn the lights up on the panel over there, you can see. And we've got a good amount of time for conversation and discussion, so the floor is open. Yes.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very interesting to me. I should have mentioned that I'm interested in institutional for universities to develop in context This is great. I want to ask, you mentioned duress for all of higher education. Do you feel that there's a special or different pressure being put on arts and humanities in the context that you described, in which earning is an almost universal goal for undergraduates, and in which public discourse assumes education's function is basically to train future technicians, scientists and engineers, and this is among progressives, the people who are in favor of the traditional university. Do you see that, and what would you think some prospects might be forever survival?
Yeah. So to answer briefly, I think it's better than 5 years ago. And here's what, but you're absolutely right. Arts and humanities have been under distress as the country, as the country kind of appreciated its culture more and more via commodification and consumerism and numbers and metrics, and the explosive rise of MBA programs took over, and the need for engineers and scientists. Yes, arts and humanities started diminishing in popularity. I don't know of any college or university that hasn't seen a decrease in the number of students majoring in humanities and an uptick in the number of students who major in science, or at least who start out majoring in science. The real growth actually has been in the social sciences, but I think that's because many get in the sciences and they don't like it or they can't make it and they shift over. That's what I've seen personally. But now another interesting thing is going on, and it's around the entrance into an entrepreneurial and innovation culture, where the prospect is that many of the jobs in the economy around the world and in the U.S. will be much more around innovation and entrepreneur and design. And so what's happening now is that MBA programs are tanking, not Chicago's, not Yale's, and not Harvard's, but across the country other than the top 20, the MBA programs are simply diminishing. We have lost 45% of our applicants in the last 5 years. So we basically, this is MBA. Now again, if you're, the Whartons and the Harvards and the Chicagos are fine, but everybody else is diminishing. Employers don't want them. Employers would rather hire, what they really want to hire right now is somebody who has an undergrad degree in English and business, an undergrad degree in English and business. They want these cross-disciplinary. Many employers are looking at the arts and certain types of humanities as a driver of innovation. And you can see this around the country. Schools are getting smart. I'm trying to push DU there. And saying, do a minor in music, do a minor in philosophy. Religion is a little iffy still. People are all still thinking we're bad Sunday school teachers. That's been the case for years in higher ed, Divinity and religion major. But it's an interesting twist. So I wouldn't say that it's all fine now. But there is a way in which the humanities and the arts are seen as more important as schools become defined around innovation. So look at Stanford and look at MIT, two places that have done that incredibly well, kind of redefined. Penn is in the midst of doing it, linking the arts and humanities to these large innovative centers. I don't know if you know IDEO. IDEO was probably the first, it was a spin-off from Stanford, and the same people who started something called the Design School at Stanford started IDEO. So IDEO is a company in Palo Alto that brought together engineers, anthropologists, English majors, artists to solve problems. They were on 60 Minutes one time. A group of them went and redesigned a shopping cart. You know those shopping carts now that are kind of two-tiered? So this was the 60-minute episode. These anthropologists, artists, whatever, they all went in and they watched how people shopped, and they realized those big, deep carts really aren't very satisfactory. So IDEO designed that two-tiered cart we have. IDEO now runs all over the world, and the idea is to have these teams people from the humanities, the social sciences, engineering and computer science problems altogether. So it's opened up a kind of new opportunity. There's a book by Marge Garber. It's her most recent one. Marge is at Harvard, very famous Shakespeare scholar, also wrote in higher ed. And I can't remember the title, but it is this phenomenon where she is arguing that the way to save the humanities is to link it to the innovative, creative impulse of humanity. It's maybe a mixed blessing, but it has meant that I think universities have stopped slashing the humanities.
This might hit a little close to home, but one thing I didn't hear mentioned was the explosion in administrative hires and expenditures. I was wondering how that, I mean, you're trying to at least make such a career available or exciting for us. So, you know, the fact that people are hiring is a good thing. But I'm wondering if you can speak about how that might impact or influence the university at large or the future of education.
Yeah, there certainly has been an increase in administrative hiring. But if you parse that down, much of that is on the student services side. So again, it's this, I don't want to be derogatory about it, because there's part of me that thinks it's right. You know, 1 in 3 students come in with some kind of mental illness or suffering. So we should have a counseling center. If you saw the DU's counseling center is better than the health clinic I read to. I mean, it's so phenomenal. So you should have a program in that. But much of the administrative growth is in the student services side. Technology has actually allowed the financial services side to reduce nationally. Another big area, of course, is technology. So I don't know, when I was at the Div School, well, we didn't really have technology. I actually tried to write my dissertation on a K-Pro. Didn't you know where the K-Pro was? One of those, yeah, early computers, but the dissertation czar refused them. UC was never going to allow dissertations. It cost me $800 at a time.
Wow.
So anyway, I think it's a yes, there has been administrative growth, and some has been probably excessive, but a lot of it has been around services and regulation and technology.
Would you add to that also, though, the assessment industry? So in order to meet the demands of regulation about outcomes, we've got assessment officers.
I have a kind of question on a similar vein and probably just as controversial. I spent some time in higher administration before coming back here to the Div School and have a close circle of friends, all of whom are kind of aspiring to college or university presidencies kind of as a career track. But all of them are taking very different approaches. I'm probably the only one that's in a traditional academic program. And we spend a lot of time debating about whether or not getting a PhD is a worthwhile investment for one who aspires to be a college or university president, and whether or not it makes sense for the role. And so I'm wondering, as one who has a kind of traditional academic background and has rose through the ranks, how that has helped or informed how you govern as an administrator, but then also address this question about whether or not in the 21st century, kind of a faculty member who rises to become dean, provost, president is a realistic expectation for the future, or whether or not kind of those who go the MBA or JD route, come from industry, that kind of thing, are going to become more common for the university presidency.
You know, that reminds me, I should have said when we were talking about the MBA programs dissolving the law schools. Even the top ones are having trouble getting students. So I'm a real believer in people getting their PhDs. And I guess maybe we always believe our own path is the best way, so I should begin by that confession. But what it has meant for me is that I really do have an internal knowledge of that quest of teaching and the quest of research and the importance Nadine and I were talking about before, the importance of the basic research, the importance of some of your dissertations that may not have any immediate instrumental value, but are good in themselves, and may someday, the implications of what yield an insight. I always talk about the basic science example. The government doesn't want to fund basic science any longer. But if we didn't have basic science, we wouldn't have the cure for polio, the cure for AIDS. It's so important. So I think it's, from my perspective, and this is why I like the layman essay, but it's so important for someone to understand the role of research and the role of knowledge and the quest of knowledge, not only in its contribution for society, but the sheer joy of it. The other night I was with a group of undergrads. Now to you students, here I go again, are not Swarthmore students. I mean, they're smart, they're really smart, but they're not that great knowledge. That's like Swarthmore had, but they're really smart. And I went around the room and I asked them what was their most exciting and transformative academic experience. And, I thought the business majors would say, business, whatever. Everyone, there were about 20, everyone told some kind of version of the same story, which was their phenomenal pride and thrill in being obsessed with some capstone course, some woman, a communications major, talking about a paper she wrote on her favorite monster movie, and what it was like to take something that she liked and go down deep and be pushed by her faculty member. So that's what I worry about. Will the MBA and the lawyer get that? Some of them will, but I think it will be very tempting. I mean, I work with lawyers on the boards, and they're really great with compliance, and some of them get the research side. And the MBAs are really good with the finance side. And some of them get the academic side. But I worry about it. So I keep encouraging people to get their PhDs and take back to the presidency. Now that said, a good friend of mine was president of Bowdoin for 10 years, Barry Nelson, phenomenal president, came out of a legal background, but he really understood education. Yes.
Two questions, one really short. I was wondering if you could direct us to any sort of literature with regards to these businesses sort of being at the forefront of diversity stuff, because I think that'd just be really valuable to have in our toolbox. And two, as religious studies programs attract fewer majors, but continue to have minors and have people just taking the courses sort of as, what are they called, service courses. How do you think we as future professors and as people entering the market should sort of reframe how we think about the teaching of the curriculum of religious studies as it moves into more this interdisciplinary approach?
Those are two really, really good questions. So for what's going on with employers saying this, I would suggest you go to the AACNU website, American Association of Colleges and Universities, which is a fabulous organization, kind of the leading liberal arts, liberal education, humanities-based organization. And I think it's under their LEAP program, LEAP program. They have done surveys with a firm called Ray Hart and Associates, who surveyed employers for years. And you can see over the years how the increase has occurred around this issue of diversity. And I off the top of my head, I can't, I guess the other place, and it's kind of an indirect route, is so go to the amicus briefs filed in the University of Michigan court case a few years ago. Coca-Cola, Toyota, it was really fascinating. One of the things that helped convince the Supreme Court to allow Michigan to go ahead and allow diversity as a criteria was not that it was all of our associations in higher ed that were filing, and we all were. It was all the businesses that were filing. So that's another case.
Thank you.
Wait a minute, you had another question?
So yeah, as we're basically increasingly teaching service courses, how should we be thinking about the curriculum differently for religious studies?
Well, I would say say two things. One, I think again, when you read the Hart study, one of the refreshing things is that employers still want critical thinkers. They still expect college to produce people who can take any problem and think, or any situation or any text and think about it critically and write clearly. So there's a sense in which keeping the tradition of critical and thinking and communication is important. So I think there are two ways to kind of position oneself and position the curriculum. One is, I think religion ought to be much more interdisciplinary with things like politics and political science. So I taught at Colgate co-taught with a political scientist a course on theology and politics. And we used theologies, and, you know, it was a way to get students to realize that they had to be respectful of how people believed. And the religion couldn't be this objectified study. That when they went out in the world, and again they were Colgate graduates, and they go out in the business world, they had to be deeply respectful of the experience, no matter what it was. It was an immensely popular course, and I think those courses around the country are very popular. At our School of International Affairs, the courses in religion and politics are very, very popular. And the other thing I would say is that, you know, religion has always been an interdisciplinary field. I mean, we were talking about that at the Div School. You know, it's never been just one discipline. So I think there's a way in which positioning the Department of Religion as a kind of natural interdisciplinary, you know, knowing how to do interdisciplinary studies is extremely good, because many of the other departments can't say the same.
Can I just jump in? 2 weeks ago when I was reading Governor Scott Walker's comments about the University of Wisconsin, when he used the phrase service courses, they just drift with such contempt and dismissal that I think one thing we should do is stop using the term. I mean, I know it's administratively useful, but when we call them service courses, I think we're demeaning our own country.
I think it's a really good point. And again, one place, one opening that allows us to do that as the culture begins to think that education and the university has more of a responsibility than just information, but the formation of the whole human being, allows us to get away from this notion that there are maybe some courses that are real and some that are just service. Yes, go ahead.
Third time.
Third time.
I would like to ask you to explore more this idea of intentional community. It's not vague, but it's a little bit ephemeral. I'm just not sure. You know, in theory, you know, what is your pitch to donors, to students? Do they understand this coming in? Is it different before they get there versus when they get there in practice? How do you implement such a thing? How do you get people on the same page? Is it just about shared space? My undergrad college now does the first year experience, right? So everyone's doing kind of a similar thing. Their first year. And then, of course, the liberal arts versus the university said, is there a place for community in both? Is it look different, right? So I'm just kind of floating these ideas, thinking about your analogy to being a priest. You know, my wife's a priest. Church, we talk about community all the time. I mean, what does it mean to be an intentional community?
Right. This is kind of a pastoral moment. As a prophet, I think there's a prophetic moment too. So, you know, it is really vague, and it's vague for me too. And right now we're in a strategic planning process. We're trying to think what might that mean for DU. And so I'm just going to talk about it abstractly. So I think the issue is, if the culture is allowing us this opportunity and forcing it upon us to be more aware of the environment, of the 24/7 environment in which college students live, is there a way we can educate them to live intentionally in communities. And the intentional comes from, if you don't, they're going to naturally go to kind of birds of a feather flock together, right? Some kids will all go to a certain Greek house, other kids will stay in athletics. The bigger the university, the more you see this. But you also see it at small residential colleges too. So part of being intentional is to say, yes, you got to let everybody have their comfort zone. Absolutely. But if employers are saying we need workers for a more diverse economy, and if you feel like I do, that we just need to become a much more equitable nation and more inclusive, can you intentionally design an experience in which students are given the skills to know how to work together and how to live together? Because I think one of the things that, again, I worked on this, even as a college student, I worked on this. One of the things somehow we expected magically, if we added women and persons of color and international students, we just expected it would all be, kumbaya, right? We all just work or something. I don't know what we expected. But I think now the awareness is we have many of our universities are more diverse. So Swarthmore was, the year I left, 49% white. DU is about 20% students of color. But how to help bring people together in a way that is intentional. It's not like there are models out there in the country. So the intentionality is trying to figure out how to use that almost incubator environment we have to address some of these concerns, both politically and morally, but also for the employment. So there's all sorts of experiments right now. Washington and Jefferson takes the college first-year students, and everyone has to live with someone very diverse, and they assign it, and they decide what very diverse is. So sometimes it's a far-right Republican, a far-left Democrat. Sometimes it's persons of different religion, right? And then they have a series of educational programs and training and practices. Other schools are experimenting with living and learning communities. So at DU, we have about 25% of our students in the living and learning communities that are really impressive. They live together in the dorms for the first 2 years. And what's unique about the DU's living and learning community is there's academic courses that go along with it, so the faculty are engaged. If you want to have an impact on a student's life, you have to have the faculty engaged. I'm a firm believer in that. So, I think we're all trying to figure out, and it's like many innovative issues. It's a matter of needs and opportunities and kind of waking up one morning and saying, wait a minute, we have people here 24/7, and why do we think these issues are going to magically solve themselves? So I can't be any more specific. I think it's a time of a lot of experimentation.
Thank you very much for your fascinating presentation. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your experiences in leadership, specifically as a woman, and if you have any advice for women who are in leadership roles.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have any advice.
But experiences worth sharing.
Yeah, well, I've been the first woman in almost every position. First woman dean, first woman provost, first woman president 3 times. So I think one's personality so much makes a difference that almost, I would say, before you go that route, if you're a woman, it's best to realize that if you're easily rattled or if you're easily quick to fight the social justice cause, it's not a good place. You'll be exhausted by the end of day one. I tend to have a little more ironic personality, and a lot of stuff just rolls off, or I think to myself, I'll fix it. Not right now, but I'll get it fixed. So a lot of it's personality, and I think Mary Sue Coleman, former president of University of Michigan, and a friend of mine says the problem of women in administration is there's a professional niceness we're required to have. And I think that's true. I think we're still in an era where if you're a woman leader, you have to be, nice and diplomatic and move things along. Some days I think things have gotten better. There certainly are many, many more women than men. And then other days I go home and I think, God, it was like the div school in 1983 where the guys wouldn't let me into a little seminar in theology because I was a woman. I don't have any really good advice other than I do think one has to know his personality. I have friends, and I see it and experience the kind of sexualized issues and the misogynization as much as anyone, but they can't tolerate it. And they literally physically can't. They have to stop right there and deal with it. And I can kind of swing on by a lot of it. I don't know. What do you think?
A lot of things. I appreciate very much. I do think that personality is a piece of it. I do think that there's not a ready-made cultural model that you walk into, right? So in addition to doing all the things on the slides, you're also creating a model for yourself, and a model that one hopes is perpetuatable by others and not just by yourself. And it's a tough one also when it's the issue that you're the woman who's an administrator and when it's just you're the administrator. And the fact that you're a woman can be used as actually a dodge away from the things we really ought to be talking about, which are the issues at stake. There is something that's called the girl tax, the girl tax, and that is that women in higher education, in other things too, as well as colleagues of color, there's a higher institutional burden because of the very good, usually, impulse to have more women and more underrepresented minorities involved in the governance structures of the institution. And so I think another piece of that is to just assess whether you're willing that that's going to be a part of the commitments that you make. You can't do everything all at once. So that's just a couple of things. But I do think it is changing. Whoever comes in after you won't be the first, and whoever comes in after me won't be the first. And so, eventually. But I walk to my office every day through 12 men's pictures.
I was thinking about that.
Or is it 11? I think I'm 12. So, but it's also, I guess I would say as well, that institutions can be nurturing and places of flourishing for a broad array of persons that aren't necessarily led by persons who are automatically identified there. So it's not the case that men are not leaders who can affirm the places of women, other things as well. So I don't want to overemphasize the individual role of the woman in administration.
I will say, I think it's really important. 60% of the presidents in this country are 60 or over. So they're going to be massive retirements. And that means massive opportunities. And if you just think deans and provosts will move up, there's going to be lots of opportunities. And if it's important, it's like diversifying the faculty because the students need to be able to see the persons in leadership position who look like them or who don't look like them. They're diversified. Yes.
So, in addition to the question that's already been addressed about the value of liberal arts education or the humanities in our universities today, as there's been attached to that question in the discussions has been, I guess in some circles, the question of, well, what is the liberal arts and what curriculum does it consist of, and what courses are foundational to it, and you know, the subject of the idea of core curriculum, the common core experience, all these different things. And you mentioned Bowdoin. This is one instance where that question came up in a very ugly way, but Bowdoin was the subject of a very vicious study that someone who just wanted whatever, and they showed that Bowdoin, tried to show that Bowdoin had all these courses focused on ethnic politics and particular identities, and very little, nothing that constituted common American ideas and you know, civic educational values, which basically they used Bowdoin to make a larger point about the liberal arts curriculum in America, which some people do believe has some validity, that the curriculum has fundamentally changed in many colleges and is changing, where students are taking more and more courses that are very narrowly focused on one particular thing, and you know, you have schools where you can pretty much take whatever you want with no core curriculum. So my question is basically, how prevalent is that question and debate in the universities that you've been at amongst the faculty, and how is it a concern of the faculty, or is this something that I've just been hearing about as a Bowdoin alum, and that's why I think about it a lot? Or are university presidents all grappling with this question because their faculty are grappling with the question and they're divided over it? Because I've heard some colleges are and some aren't.
It is real spotty. I mean, the Bowdoin one was really a surprise, given the nature of the Bowdoin alumni body. So there is an organization called ACTA, and I block what that stands for, so you have to Google it. It was started by Lynn Cheney, and it is a very conservative organization that very much believes that we are failing America by not teaching particular aspects of American history, American civics, and American politics. And so they do things like go through people's curriculums, and they give them a grade. I think Chicago's was an F. I think every school that I've been at, I've never been so proud of it. But they are well funded. They are incredibly well funded, and they send out these glossy brochures and books to all the boards. They go on the websites, they find out every board member's name, and they send these out. So Swarthmore, I actually had one board member who really got into it and was very concerned about it. Colgate, I had a few more. DU, I have many. So it's more the boards. I don't think there are many faculty. I think by and large the faculty in the liberal arts in America believe that because of where knowledge is headed, that the liberal arts it's more and more about how you think critically, how you design knowledge. If anything, I think where the faculties are is to push it around, not simply critique the creativity and innovation and interdisciplinarity. With the web and information so accessible on the web, why would anyone want to sit around and memorize American civics? So I don't think it's a big debate on it within American faculty, but I think it is a reflection of a certain kind of political debate about from basically the right in America. And I think there are some real pressures about it because they are funded not only to send these books to the board, but they can create the kind of firestorms that got created at Bowdoin. When I was at Colgate, I told you my Greek story. So the same group and FIRE, which is another group in America that loves to come around and say that we're ruining the minds of our children. They were very upset because they thought by trying to buy the fraternity houses, I was doing brainwashing and other terrible, horrible. I was creating a totalitarian environment. They attacked me as a woman. this is what happens when you have a woman president. She's going to destroy the Greek system. So, went crazy for a while and then finally responded. But as I said earlier, there are real ideological issues in the academy right now. There are real significant pressures.
Can I follow up on that a little bit? Just because I really appreciated what you said, and I agree with it about the worrisome and grievously worrisome lack of trust in institutions and in government, which is something that has taken place really very much through our lifetime. I mean, that it's a huge cultural shift. How does one reclaim, or maybe even to take the critic's position, earn the trust back as an institution? Those of us who really believe in higher education, whose lives have been transformed by it, who are dedicating our work to it, that how do you get the tipping point the other way to say, it seems like some things are self-evident, right? Nobody wants a brain surgeon who doesn't have the absolute best training. Right? But when it comes to some of the humanistic disciplines, the things that we study, the ways in which there's an erosion of confidence, an erosion of sense of recognition of expertise, and what it might offer to the public sphere. And now I'm painting the most negative side of that, but if you recognize that picture, how do we get that trust or ensure that trust where it is and what might be wavering?
I don't know that I have an answer to that. I do think some of this will all settle down eventually, like the erosion of the MBA programs is a good sign in a way. I mean, it's a sign that we're going to start thinking about other kinds of things. I guess what I would say is just I think the Academy drew into itself in this high research period starting in the 50s and 60s when there was just so much money. I mean, when I was a junior faculty member at Emory, the Lilly Foundation called me up out of the blue one day and says they'd like to fund me to do a 2-year study on what's happening to women in theological education. And they just gave me tons of money to travel around. I mean, it was such a period where even as a humanist, they were coming to you, and it was easy to get funds, and it wasn't like scientists, but there was funding. And I think in that period we stopped talking to the public. There were people here like Marty that always said, this is not going to be good for us. We need to be out there talking to the public. But across the academy, faculties dropped out of Rotary. They dropped out of being civic citizens. If you study kind of the history of the faculty life of American faculty, it really wasn't until the 60s or 70s that the majority of faculty became these pretty disconnected to their communities. Don Kennedy has a wonderful book called Academic Duty, where he talks about how for years faculty members would say, I'm a faculty member at DU in Denver. And then it became, I'm a chemist who teaches at DU. And then I'm a chemist. And I just got 82 sightings in the American Chemical Society or something. And this kind of model of what it is to be a good faculty member. And again, I'm sure the Chicago and Harvard and Yale faculty should always be like that. But I think across America, faculty withdrew. And I think part of engaging, earning the trust, maybe to re-engage. Now, Rotary was by and large dead too, so you've got to re-engage in relevant bodies of
So I'd like to ask you about teaching, but in light of this very rich institutional and professional picture, very eye-opening picture in it, I was very struck by an image you used in your article that you sent around on the future of the liberal arts. And the image was the institution as a design studio, where maybe will read it, some not. The liberal arts college as a place where people with different skills and different backgrounds, different resources come together not only to enshrine something, but also to generate something worth enshrining, to face problems that are larger than the institution itself, and to tackle new opportunities. Maybe also with somewhat of a guild mentality of bringing new students into this, the possibilities of the craft of this design. So my question is, with that model, or with that metaphor for what an institution might be, what does the undergraduate classroom look like? What is it at the level of the individual faculty member in network community, but in that space of the classroom, given the developments that you talked about, both with the students and the technological and institutional challenges and possibilities?
So, I don't think, again, I'm kind of where Randy Bass is, I don't think the traditional classroom will disappear, but I do think that a not insignificant portion of the classroom will begin to focus more on creation and design and problem solving. So, and more of them will focus on community engagement. I don't know if you know the work of Barbara Holland, but she's a scholar who studies the impact of community engagement on education. And she maintains that the classroom is as much going to be outside as inside. So it might be, well, I'll give you a Swarthmore example. How about that? I'll give you two. So it might be a group of students literally designing and taking a course together with a group of people in the medium security prison in Chester, where some students and the residents of the prison came together with a faculty member and kind of designed a curriculum together and went through it. You know, there you've got the kind of design, the community engagement, the outside of the classroom. Another good example, a faculty member from Swarthmore's statistics faculty member was very concerned that most humanists weren't learning statistics, and she was very evangelical on this. She wanted everybody to learn statistics. She thought every American should know how to read statistics, and she couldn't get the humanists to read statistics. So she designed a course where she identified nonprofits in the local area, boys clubs, synagogues, whatever, that needed statistical analysis to do something to do their mission. And she got students signed up for those projects, and that's how she taught statistics. And the course got very, very popular. So that's a kind of thing I'm talking about. And then there are a lot, if you have an engineering school, there's a lot of kind of experiments going on, as I mentioned, between the arts and the engineering. So Swarthmore has an engineering program, and there was, the year I left, I could not believe the number of students who were coming in wanting to major in theater and engineering, music and engineering. It's a very hands-on generation.
I was in the group that did the Greening of Swarthmore audit with my boss before you got there, but I think that was still sort of in the air.
Yes. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. Someone who hasn't had a chance yet?
Final question. I've got a class at 2, so I was like, how long am I stay? You mentioned the kind of growing disparity between public colleges and universities and private. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that and about the impact on those who are preparing for either faculty or administrative careers in higher ed, and how to prepare yourself for the reality of that growing disparity.
Yeah. Well, I don't really know what to say about the preparation. I think that what I see going on with my friends in public institutions is their classes are getting larger and larger and larger, and the time for research is being diminished. And there are fewer and fewer TAs. So I have a friend who teaches at UMass Amherst. And, you know, I think when she went there, her classes were 70, and now they're 200. And, you know, she used to have TAs, she doesn't have TAs. So I really think it's around money. And publics are increasing their tuition, but they're expanding because it's the only way to make their financial model work. So I think in the publics, there are these design studios and their practices, but they're in their honors colleges. For the masses, they're really just conveying information.
Okay, so we'll close our session here. Please join me in a very warm thank you to Chancellor Chopp.
Good luck to all of you, and I hope you all get great teaching jobs, but if you ever want to know more about administration, give me a call.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.